Sheldon, do you want to put up the opening slide? Well, welcome everybody to the Canada-China Friendship Society. My name is Roy Atkinson. I'm a past president of the society, and in the last several years, I've been heading up the Ottawa Canada-China Film Festival, which is a project of the CCFS. Now, I'd like to welcome all of you, and I must say we're very pleased that we have well over 100 people who have registered for this evening. And I'd also like to welcome Senator Wu, our esteemed guest. And when I was checking back in my files just recently, I discovered that it was almost 4 years to the day since I first introduced Senator Wu to the CCF audiences as a speaker. And as he said, there's a lot of water that's gone under the bridge since then. Now, could we have the next slide, please, Shelton? I'm just going to take a minute here to give you a few pieces of the administrative things. I mean, as you might well imagine, the CCFS has been undergoing all of the standard COVID stresses that any organization undergoes. So this just will give you a sense about where we've arrived. We're continuing to have speaker events online, of which this evening's is a prime example. And the Ottawa Canada-China Films Festival continues as well, and I'll talk a bit more about that, the adaptations we have made. And then in addition to that, we're think of it as a service for members. As we find articles, videos, websites, social media items that we think are interesting and informative, then we will be sharing those with our members in our mailing list. There are a number of things that have been deferred, not canceled, but deferred until we get through this COVID thing. Obviously, the Chinese New Year's banquet just can't be done in these circumstances, as are opportunities of traveling on delegations to China and receiving delegations from China. And in the past, we've had many receptions, and these things are just not possible in these current circumstances. But hopefully, when we all get past this COVID business and the vaccines are widely distributed, we'll be able to renew our program. But throughout all of this, the CCFS itself remains unchanged. It's an independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan NGO. It's member financed, and it's basically a group of people with an interest in China. And our mission continues to be to help Canadians learn about China and to understand it better. And the events that we put on are all in and around that kind of activity. Now, on the next slide, we have our upcoming events. I'll just talk a little bit about that so you can hopefully get excited about these things. In March, Mark Kruger, who was at the Bank of Canada and has spoken to us before, is extremely knowledgeable about all things economic. He is now living in China and working at Yaiqi Global, which is China's largest financial media conglomerate. As a result of that, he's right in the middle of all of the reporting and observing of what's going on in China. And his presentation in March is timed so that he'll be able to speak about China's latest 5-year plan. We're in discussions with other speakers, and as those things are finalized, we'll let you all know so that hopefully you can join us for those events. Now, for the Ottawa Canada-China Film Festival, as you might imagine, getting together in the theater is not on. So we've adapted. And what we're doing is we're monitoring online film festivals, special events, things that are available online. And when we find something that we think is interesting and worthwhile and would help people learn about China, we let people know about it. We post them, we put it on our social media, we put it up on the website. So should be a fairly steady stream of new cinematic material. And in addition to that, we have a number of special things that we're doing. Tomorrow, assuming the technology gods don't let us down, we'll be publishing a paper on the remembrances of Canada-China relations from 1788, when the first Chinese settlers arrived on the west coast of Vancouver Island, up to 1970, when Canada established diplomatic relations with China. And what distinguishes this particular project is, we try to make it historically accurate. We've included all of the major events, but along the way, whenever we can find a film, a documentary, an audiovisual production, photographs, pictures, images, we've included them so that this is a very different tour through the Canada-China relations, and because cinema in particular accesses completely different ways. You get to meet and feel and understand the people and the events in a way that you can't in an academic paper, no matter how good it is. And there are some really amazing things that I at least discovered through this project, including the fact that, well, in fact, 1788, there were Chinese settlers on the west coast of Canada. In the late 1800s, Canadians were helping to finance Sun Yat-sen's revolution in China that led to the creation of the People's Republic. In the World War I, there were 18,000 Chinese laborers that were almost smuggled across Canada so they could go to the front in World War I in Europe. And just a whole variety of resources and stories and tales that I found fascinating myself, and I hope you'll enjoy it. And we've also be publishing, hopefully tomorrow, a filmography of all Canadian films made about China between 1941 and 1970. 1970 again being excuse me, that's not right. It was 1941 to 2010. But it was put together by Professor Gary Evans on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of Canada-China diplomatic relations. We also have a couple of special events. Dr. Birsiu from Carleton University in conversation with Stephen Chappell about the best of Chinese cinema. It's based on a course she gave. And we have, throughout all of these places, we try to provide links where you can go to see the films or the documentaries if you wish to. We've got a special interview with Chinese-Canadian director about her inspirations for Chinese-Canadian filmmakers and playlists. So there's lots that'll be coming over the coming months from the festival, and we hope that you'll continue to tap into those and enjoy it. And if you'd like to be sure of being up to date on any of the things we're doing, you can sign up for our for emails on our website. And as a small volunteer organization, it won't be a surprise to any of you, I'm sure, that there's always room for more volunteers, both on the executive of the CCFS or volunteers to support our various programs and on the film festival. If you'd like to participate in any way, just see one of the executives or go to our website. There's a contact us link there. Let us know about your interest, and I'm sure we'll be able to find a way to sort of draw you in or to make you part of the whole exercise. And while I'm here, I would like to mention as well the incredible value that a CCF membership has. It is $40 for a family, $25 for an individual, and only $15 for a student for a year. And the executive, in the current circumstances, because our costs are down, because we don't have to rent halls for speaker events and movie theaters for anything, has decided to extend the membership for current members, no charge, through to the end of June. And for any new members that sign up, it'll be a special free bonus period through until the end of June before your paid membership kicks in. And I must say that it's very helpful to have a strong membership. If for no other reason than when we're talking to speakers, they'll often ask, how many members do you have and how many people come out to your events? And in a very simple way, larger numbers make a difference. So if you would like to support the organization, we'd be delighted to have you join as a member. If you're reluctant to do that, then you can still sign up to get all of our emails and be informed about our events on the website, which is ccfso.org. And for tonight, if I could just give you a quick rundown on what we're going to be doing. We will very quickly get into our special speaker, Senator Wu, and he's talking about China as a global neighbor and towards rethinking Canada-China relations, a very timely subject for us and indeed for the world. And just as a small aside here, for those of you who are joining us where you have access to your own computer or screen that you can work on. Down at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A button. If you click that, you can ask questions to Senator Wu either now or anytime during the presentation. And we'll be trying to have as many of those addressed as possible. They will go to Lorraine Farkas, who was a past president of the organization and on the current executive, and she'll be trying to assemble the questions so that we get like questions together, and she'll take over for the Q&A period, and with Senator Wu to try to put the questions to him. As I said, we'll try to get through to as many of those as we can. And don't forget, that's the Q&A button at the bottom. Please feel free to use it now or at any time. And when the Q&A session is over, I'll take over again, offering our thanks to Senator Wu on behalf of everybody. So with that, let me introduce Senator Wu. He was appointed to the Canadian Senate in 2016, where he sits as an independent representing British Columbia. And in only a year, he was elected as the facilitator for the Independent Senators Group, a new and I'm sure challenging task of bringing all these independent, free-thinking senators together to discuss and form positions on legislation proposed by the government. But he came well equipped for this task. He has 3 decades of experience in strategy and policy for business and government and nonprofit organizations. He's a leading thinker on international economic issues and Canada-Asian relations. He's on several Senate committees, including the Foreign Affairs and International Trade, National Finance, Agriculture and Forestry. And he's the vice chair, of the Canada-US Interparliamentary Group. He joined, prior to joining the Senate, he was the president and CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation, and he continues to serve there. He was a senior resident fellow at the Reedy School of Business at Simon Fraser, a senior fellow in public policy at the Institute for Asian Research at UBC, a co-founder and president of China Global. And just to prove that he's really a Renaissance man, he's also active in the promotion of Chinese arts and culture, and he's at the Academy of Music in Vancouver, and sits on any number of boards, including the Canadian Ditchley Foundation. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn the mic over to Senator Wu. Senator.
Roy, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Thank you to Lorraine and all of the executive of the CCFS Ottawa for having me back for this year's discussion on Canada-China relations. I do remember when you introduced me some years ago, that was my first outing, maybe my second actually. I think I spoke to CCFS even before I became a senator. But at the time we were talking about China's relations with her neighbors, and many of the themes that we touched on back then have only magnified today, and which form part of the discussion in my presentation this evening. I want to also commend to all of the participants the 50-year anniversary cinematic remembrance of Canada-China relations that Roy referred to. I believe it will be posted on the CCFS website by tomorrow. I've had the privilege of getting a sneak preview. I give it 3 thumbs up, and I know you will as well, and I do very much encourage you to take a look at it. If for no other reason than to think about the history that Roy has offered in the context of what I'm going to say tonight. And one of the things I believe you will quickly spot is that many of the themes I'm going to present this evening are themes that run through the history of the Canada-China relationship, not just back to diplomatic recognition in 1970, but even before then. And I'll try to draw attention to some of those parallels as I go through my presentation. I'm going to speak rather quickly because I have a lot of material and I do want to save time for Q&A. So do excuse me if I seem to be rushing through. Let me just start by saying that for those of you who were hoping to hear me back in February 2020, this is the speech that didn't happen. And it didn't happen, as you know, because of COVID-19. It was a very wise decision on the part of CCFS at the time, ahead of the curve, I should say, to take precautions by not having the event. Now, it would be an understatement to say that a lot has changed in the last 9 months. And yet, on the most important questions that impinge on today's topic, which is the future of Canada-China relations, the situation at the end of 2020 is more or less the same as at the start of the year. If anything, the trends that were in place before 2020, before COVID-19, have only hardened. And while it is fashionable nowadays with our COVID-tinted lenses to remark on how everything has changed, I believe the fundamental forces that play on Canada's ties with the People's Republic of China remain in place. And if anything, they are gathering strength. Now, this is not to say that Canada's choices with respect to our relations with China are in any way predetermined. More so than any time since the debates around diplomatic recognition of the PRC in the 60s, there's a groundswell of opinion on the need to rethink Canada-China relations. And like the earlier debate more than 50 years ago, there are recurring themes. You will see some of these in Roy's cinematic recollection. But here are some of the recurring themes. Pressure from the United States to do something different. The desire for a more independent foreign policy on the part of Canada. Fear of communism. Revulsion over human rights abuses in China. Economic interests and realpolitik. The most important difference today, I believe, comes in the last two items I mentioned. First of all, our economic interests vis-a-vis China are much larger than they were in the 60s and 70s. And more importantly, China's economic weight in the world is far greater than it was in the immediate post-war period. All of you are familiar with these stats, but I will recite them anyway. China's share of global output was barely 1% in the 1970s, compared to about 18% today. And while China's GDP growth has slowed this year and in recent years, and it may well slow yet further, it has already expanded to such a size that even modest growth in China amounts to a significant boost to the world economy. The world woke up to this fact after the 2008 global financial crisis, when China emerged as the most important source of global demand, accounting for as much as half of global growth over the next decade. This year, in 2020, amid economic downturns across the world, China will be the only major country to show positive growth for the year as a whole, albeit at a lower level than was expected pre-COVID. The realpolitik of relations of China has also been a consistent and, I would say, accelerating theme in our consideration of relations with Beijing. Back in the 60s, Diefenbaker, Lester Pearson, Pierre Trudeau could only guess at the importance of bringing China into the international community. They did so in the belief that Beijing would be less disruptive in the tent than outside of it. Today, China is truly a global player, and Chinese actions around the world, for better or worse, touch on Canadian interests, whether we like it or not. Think about demand for natural resources, climate change, Arctic policy, peacekeeping, and, well, pandemics, just to name a few. Whereas in the previous 50 years, it was possible to pursue an essentially piecemeal and transactional relationship with China it will be untenable in the years ahead for Canada to treat relations with China as simply the sum of our interactions in trade, investment, culture, education, and people to people ties. At the same time, we cannot wish away the impact and influence of China by pursuing a disengagement strategy that seeks to severely reduce the range of interactions that Canada has with Chinese counterparts. In the current context where the detention of a senior Chinese executive in Vancouver has resulted in callous retaliation against a Canadian businessman and a Canadian diplomat in China, as well as adverse consequences for Canadian agricultural exports, this transactional approach that I described is clearly not working. Now, many critics of the current approach have reached for what seems like the obvious solution, which is to dramatically reduce transactions with China. But this response is naive about the prospects for diversification into other markets, and it severely underestimates the importance of the Chinese market and the role of Chinese enterprises in supply chains far beyond the People's Republic. To those who say, quote, we should diversify our business links away from China to the rest of Asia, my response as a former CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada is as follows. While it may be possible to have a China business strategy without Asia, it is highly unlikely that you can have an Asia business strategy without China. Happy to elaborate on this if there is interest on this point. Finding an approach to China that is strategic rather than transactional, much less one that is based on shunning China, will not be easy. And I do not pretend to offer a comprehensive or definitive answer, which is why I believe relations with China will be the biggest foreign policy challenge for Canada for the foreseeable future. To be clear, I am not saying that Canada-China relations are more important than Canada-US relations. Positive ties with Washington, D.C. will remain the most important foreign policy priority for Ottawa. But, we more or less know the playbook for dealing with our neighbors to the south, even during the disruption of a Trump administration. It's not over yet, by the way. And we were able to use the playbook, even with Trump, because of our shared history, shared values, and the deep connections across the border that go well beyond politics and diplomacy. We have much less connective tissue when it comes to Canada-China relations, which is why it is going to be so hard in the years ahead. Indeed, if we want a more mature relationship with a major power such as China, we are going to have to grow connective tissue in the right places so that our interests can be protected when the relationship takes a tumble. Canada-China diplomatic relations have always operated in the shadow of Canada-US ties. This was as true when Diefenbaker decided to sell wheat to China in the face of opposition from JFK, as it was when Jean Chrétien agreed to grant China most favored nation status, contrary to the position taken at the time by the Clinton administration. It is still the case today, only more so because of the heightened competition between the United States and China that is spilling over to Canada and other countries that are caught in the middle. On the one hand, US policymakers are dismayed that economic engagement with China has not resulted in a relaxation of political control on the part of the CCP or greater openness to foreign competition in the Chinese market. On the other hand, the Chinese leadership, especially since the advent of Xi Jinping, has become more self-assured, if I can put it that way, maybe even cocky in its self-assessment of national economic and military capabilities, and accordingly has become more assertive in the defense of its policies domestically and abroad. Some of you are familiar with the jingoistic slogan in China, 站起来, 富起来, 强起来. China has stood up, it has become wealthy, now it wants to become powerful. So the China-US strategic competition has all the hallmarks of great power competition. And it has all of the attendant risks for each side as well as for third parties, as the history of power transition will attest. To date, the geopolitics of US-China strategic competition is couched in euphemisms such as decoupling, techno-nationalism, deglobalization, with some commentators brushing aside the possibility of serious damage to the world economy, or worse, open conflict. There are dreamers in Beijing and Washington, D.C., who will fantasize about the rapid demise of, quote, decadent and ungovernable American society, or the sudden implosion of a, quote, corrupt and illegitimate, unquote, Communist Party. But the more likely reality is that the strategic competition between China and the United States is going to be decades long. Jack Ma of Alibaba fame believes it's going to take 40 years. Xi Jinping himself has said it would take 30 years, but he's an optimist. In any case, as the contest deepens and lengthens, the interests of each side will increasingly take precedence over the views and preferences of third countries. There is nothing extraordinary, therefore, in saying that many of the current challenges facing the Canada-China relationship are a byproduct of US-China tensions. In many ways, this has been the story of Canada-China relations even before diplomatic recognition in 1970. But it would be correct to say that the contemporary challenge is greater than we have ever faced, because China matters so much more for Canada and the world today, and because strategic competition between the US and China will not end anytime soon. Not to mention that reliance on the United States as our most important export market and our many commitments to treaties and alliances with the US are a defining reality for Canada. We should be thinking equally hard about how to position Canada in the decades-long struggle for economic and technological supremacy between the US and China. Now, one approach is to follow the Chinese saying, 坐山观虎斗, which means you sit on the mountain and you watch the tigers fight. And indeed, my friends, there will be instances in US-China strategic competition when the best course of action for Canada is in fact not to get involved, but to merely observe from a distance. However, given the highly interconnected world that we live in and the deep ties that Canada already has with the US and China, it will be impossible to merely sit on the mountain and watch the tigers fight. For one thing, there are collateral effects from conflict between the two great powers. Often these effects are negative, such as we see in the current downturn in global markets because of the US-China trade war. Sometimes, though, the effects may be positive for Canada. For example, if Washington, D.C. makes it more difficult for top students and researchers from China to work in the United States, Canada could potentially benefit by attracting those talented individuals to come to our country. But we also cannot simply sit atop a mountain and watch the tigers fight, because there are times when one side or the other is battling for a cause or a principle that is clearly in Canada's interest. In that kind of situation, we should take a side. For example, the Trump administration was actively trying to undermine the WTO by refusing to appoint members to the appellate body. If there's no functioning WTO appellate body, the WTO as an institution ceases to be useful. In this instance, we should clearly work with China and other countries against any efforts to undermine the World Trade Organization. In the same way, there are aspects of the US China trade conflict that Canada can relate to and should support in line with American positions. These include issues of forced technology transfer, arbitrary and inconsistent application of sanitary and phytosanitary standards for food imports, and the need for further liberalization across a range of service sector industries in China. There are also any number of important issues of principle around human rights and the rule of law that Canada stands for and should stand with other liberal democracies such as the United States. The point remains, however, that the US China conflict is being fought from the perspectives of Washington, D.C. and Beijing, and neither side is thinking about the implications for Canada. That responsibility falls on the Canadian government. And I worry that on too many policy decisions involving US and Chinese interests, Ottawa is acting on assumptions and reflexes that may be obsolete rather than on a calculation of risks and benefits based on Canadian interests and Canadian realities. My friends, we do not know how long this multi-decade conflict between we do not know how this multi-decade conflict between the US and China will play out. But we should be clear that it is not a repeat of the Cold War. The Cold War was fought between two adversaries which had profoundly different systems and were significantly mismatched in their economic capabilities. The US and the Soviet Union had much fewer economic and civil society ties than the US and China currently have. And the nature of the two regimes made for military and other alliances that were much more clear-cut than is the case today. Furthermore, the Cold War was fought, certainly from the US perspective, on the assumption that the Soviet Union would eventually collapse under its own weight of economic inefficiency and unsustainable military spending, which is what happened. There are, of course, many critics of China who believe that the PRC will meet the same fate as the USSR. Indeed, some are counting on it to happen and maybe are even trying to accelerate this process. But with a Chinese economy that is already larger than the US in purchasing power parity terms, and with the Chinese market serving as the number one destination for exports from over 120 countries, we should hope that there is no sudden implosion of the Chinese economy. It is precisely that we are not in a Cold War situation where it is easy to take sides that makes China policy so challenging. This is a new foreign policy challenge, not just for Western democracies, but for all countries that are like Canada, ants scrambling for cover under two fighting elephants. From Tokyo to Canberra, Pretoria to Cairo, from Rome to London, across the Americas, foreign ministries are searching for a new playbook to advance their interests with respect to both the US and China and to avoid being trampled by either or both of the elephants. And so you ask, how do we begin to rethink China policy? You know, ask any informed Canadian, I'll ask you about how you would define Canada's relationship with China. And my guess is that your answer, the answer from most informed observers, would be either a blank look or more likely a recitation of the list of problems that are currently dominating the headlines. Meng Wanzhou, Michael Spavor, Michael Kovrig, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, canola, wolf warrior diplomacy, foreign interference, and so on. There is indeed a long list of problems that are defining the relationship. But making a list does not really define a diplomatic relationship. A list is simply a list. One could presumably make a list of good things that are going on between Canada and China, but that would also simply be a list, and it wouldn't go very far in terms of defining the bilateral relationship and helping chart a course for the future. Let me put it a different way. We are in a situation today where policymakers, the business elite, media, opinion makers, all of them can identify a lot of problems in the Canada-China relationship. But we have yet to be able to identify the problematique of Canada-China relations. I'm sorry for using jargon, but social scientists in the room will understand what I'm talking about. A problematique is not a list of problems. It is rather a way of defining the overarching problem or the overarching question that you are seeking to answer. In foreign policy terms, it boils down, I believe, to how we see China in relation to Canada. Another way of putting it is to ask the question, what is China to us? Well, over the last 50 years, we've had different definitions. Professor Paul Evans and Bernie Frolick, two of the most eminent scholars of the Canada-China diplomatic relationship, published a very well-known book describing Canada and China, at least in the early years, as reluctant adversaries. Through the 70s, probably more the 80s and early 90s, many people would have defined China as a fast-growing market for Canadian exports. In the 90s, during the Martin Hu Jintao years, we actually got to the point where Canada and China defined the relationship as a strategic partnership. So we've had many definitions, but today we don't have one. However, we're edging towards one, and I worry sometimes that we're edging towards a definition without giving sufficient thought to what it means and without proper consideration of all the factors that should go into defining the problematique. Now, the Globe and Mail has already made up its mind in an editorial, I think a year ago or so. It clearly said China is a threat to Canada. Some of you may agree with that, and perhaps there are many Canadians who do, or some Canadians who do. But if you land on a problematique which says that China is a threat, you have to follow through, obviously, on what all of that means. So I don't want to land on a definition with any firmness right now. I want to present a suggestion, but you can see why it is so important that I'm focusing on the problematique of the Canada-China relations than simply a recitation of the problems. Let me offer one way of thinking about what China is to us and my own initial stab at defining the problematique. The term I would use, as you see in the title of my speech, is that of the global neighbor. Now, some of you are already recoiling that I dare to describe a regime that can be so brutal towards its own citizens as a neighbor. But my friends, this is exactly the point. You don't get to choose your neighbors. I mean, maybe you do if you move, but if you don't have a choice of moving, you don't get a chance to choose your neighbors. And the reality of China today is that it is a neighbor for Canada wherever we are and wherever China is. Now, this is a term that is more descriptive rather than normative. And what it tries to do is to describe, to indicate that Canada is in proximity with China on so many fronts and in so many places, not just in the geographic sense, because we share the Pacific Ocean, but really on all the issues that matter to Canada domestically and internationally. In some geographies and on some issues, our stance towards our global neighbor China should be to build a very sturdy fence and maybe put up security cameras. In other areas, we should have an open border. And yet, in other areas, again, perhaps we should have something in between. But it is clear, using this framework that I've suggested, that we have our territory and China has its own. And there will be times and instances when the governance of our territory is markedly different from that of China. As in any physical neighborhood, and you will know this just thinking about where you live, relations among the inhabitants will ebb and flow. We can strive to be good neighbors at the same time as holding on to the old adage, good fences make good neighbors. Let me go on then to some of the principles for how we should exercise global neighborliness. And I see that my time is coming to an end, so I'll try and go more quickly. First, we should not give up on a liberal, rules-based international order and the role of multilateral institutions in the management of conflicts among member countries, whether we're talking about trade, climate change, or nuclear proliferation. Secondly, we should give up on the idea that it is part of Canada's mission to change China. Through the centuries, Western missionaries, explorers, colonizers, merchants, and modern-day diplomats have in one form or another pursued this goal mostly with good intentions. The high point of this historical endeavor was China's entry into the WTO in 2001, which many believe would be the turning point for the PRC to become not just a more market-oriented economy, but also one which would be more open to individual and collective liberties. We were wrong about our assumptions on how to change China, and we should be humble about whether a different strategy would produce better results. It should come as no surprise to anyone that a proud and ancient civilization such as China's would be resistant to pressures for change from outside the country, even more so now under the heightened political and ideological control of the Xi Jinping leadership. And yet, China has changed profoundly in the last 40 years. So it is not that change is impossible. And my argument, I must stress, is not that China or Chinese people are unsuited for democracy or for a high level of individual freedoms. But the change that has come about in the PRC has been driven mostly by forces from within the country and under the direction of domestic political leadership, which is not in any way immune to pressures from within. Further change in Chinese institutions and in the relationship between the Chinese state and Chinese civil society will emanate from inside China, with the role of foreign pressure playing an ambiguous role at best. Third, we should signal clearly to the Chinese leadership that we want China to succeed in its economic aspirations. At the core of the US-China strategic competition is the notion that the US does not want the PRC to become a fully developed economy, and in so doing surpass America in a range of economic and technological domains. Whether or not this is true of US intentions, it is a widely held belief in China, and it runs counter to Xi Jinping's goal of China becoming a comprehensive developed country by 2049. China should be able to articulate that we support China's goal to become a fully developed economy by 2049. More than that, we should say that we want to be part of China's journey to become a fully developed economy and to share in the country's success on the way there. Now, this appears to me to be a very difficult thing for Canada to say in the current context, but in a different world, in a different time, this would have been what one would call a diplomatic no-brainer. I'm just coming to the end now, so if you'll bear with me, and I do need to get through this part. The fourth thing I would say in our understanding of China as a global neighbor is that even as we say we want China to be successful, we should also be very clear that China differs from China on many issues related to human rights, individual freedoms, and the rule of law. And while we would wish that China's journey to becoming a developed country comes with an expansion of rights and freedoms for its citizens, our focus on those issues should be in Canada, where we have the ability to set standards and enforce laws. This means taking a stronger position on any denial of freedoms by individuals and groups in Canada with respect to issues affecting China. If Canada is to lead by example, it must act consistently in the jurisdiction where it has the power to lead, and hence it must resist and repel any attempts to interfere in Canadian democracy through coercion, corruption, and covert actions. Chinese Canadians have a special responsibility to model the values of free expression, tolerance of opposing views, and the protection of minority rights when it comes to the Canada-China relationship. And we should not accept false accusations of being either anti-China dragon slayers or puppets of a united front organization simply because we are exercising our rights as Canadians to voice opinions on both sides of the China debate. My friends, we're not living in ordinary times. Many of the assumptions of the last 40 years are no longer valid. The defining feature of the decades ahead will be strategic competition between China and the US. We hope leaders in both countries will manage this competition in a peaceful and reasonable cooperative way so that fewer ants are trampled by the elephants. But we are not heading in this direction at the moment, and the foreign policy choices that are made by third countries, including Canada, can nudge us towards a more or a less fractured world. Canadian foreign policy towards China is therefore ripe for change. This will be the single biggest foreign policy challenge for Canada in the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Wu, for that very thought-provoking presentation and very comprehensive. We'll now go on to the question and answer period. We received some questions during the week before this presentation. And also we've received a few questions that have been asked since we started. So I'll try to get to as many as I can, and I will also put some together. I'm going to start with this question, which is directly relevant to what you were trying to put across, that we need a new strategic policy, address a problematique. Senator Wu, can you point to thinkers, Canadian and otherwise, you think have answers to the problematique you mentioned, or nations that managed to formulate a sound China policy, in your opinion?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, I've offered, of course, my own statement of the problematique, and you may or may not agree with it. It is one which frames China as the global neighbor that we may or may not want to have next to us, but is there all the same. It's there both from a geographic perspective, but it's also there in terms of the interest that we have around the world and in all of the domains where Canadian interests are advanced. I've mentioned climate policy as one very striking example of how we have to see China not as the adversary when it comes to our interests on climate change, but as the big house on the corner of the street that is going to suck up all the energy unless we find a way of working with them to install renewables, if I can just sort of hackney my metaphor somewhat. In terms of other countries that may have found a better approach, every country, as I said in my speech, is struggling to come up with a new playbook. But it would seem to me that um, our friends and allies in Southeast Asia and throughout East Asia have a more acute awareness of the global neighbor that's truly their neighbor, and the need to um, avoid taking sides wherever possible in a US-China strategic conflict. We've heard many times, for example, from thinkers in Southeast Asia, that they do not want to be forced by either Beijing or DC to have to take sides on any given issue. But this is the world we are entering in now. And while Canada has the relative luxury of not being um, in China's backyard and pressured in the same way, we are nevertheless being pressured, in part by the United States, to take positions that may not be consistent with our long-term interests.
Thank you. We have another related question. In trying to define Canada's relationship to China, should we not see the problematique in terms of the decline of the US-led liberal international order and the re-emergence of civilizational states, of which China is only the paramount example?
Well, that would be less a problematique as a hypothesis or prediction. I'm not ready to make that prediction. One could make the opposite prediction, and many do, which is that the state-centered Leninist party system of the People's Republic is unsustainable. It will come to a crashing halt, maybe very soon, and that we might as well just wait it out till China collapses, and then all will be well and the Western liberal order will reassert itself. I don't think that's likely either. But you can see how this question is so important in the framing of our foreign policy, and how the assumptions we make about the future will direct our policies in the near term. I'm very worried that many of the discussions taking place now around the problems, the individual problems that we face in the Canada-China relationship are simply that, solutions for the short term without having a view, for example, of what China will look like, where China will be in 10, 20, 30 years.
Thank you. There are a number of questions about the Meng affair and the two Michaels, and I'm just trying to put them together. When will this be resolved? Is Canada really being held hostage by China, or are we being held hostage by the USA, which is using Canada to pursue its own trade war with China, or both? I think that takes into account all those related questions.
Well, let me answer the question this way. It's really a very tragic situation for Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, and it's right that the government is advocating as forcefully as it can for their release and mobilizing as much support as it can for the release of our two fellow Canadians. It's also clear, though, that it's not working. Perhaps a Biden administration will provide some fresh ideas, but I'm not sure what that would look like. If we're serious about getting the two Michaels free, and the government is serious, they even put it in the throne speech, they have two choices. One is to continue with the approach that's been taken, which hasn't been working, but maybe they know something I don't, or they have to come up with a different approach. And so far, we've been quite short on ideas in terms of different approaches. I would just say this in very broad terms. I do not think there can be any solution to the joint problem of Michael Spavor, Michael Kovrig, and Meng Wanzhou, on the other hand, without each side, the Canadian side and the Chinese side, recognizing at some level the legitimacy of the rule of law and the justice systems in the opposite side. This means as much that China has to recognize the way the rule of law is being played out in Canada, as Canada has to accept that the Chinese justice system, much as we may dislike it, is legitimate from the Chinese government's perspective. I do not see how there can be any resolution that's favorable for the detainees if there isn't some level of recognition of those I wouldn't say facts, but those realities.
Thank you. On a different theme, China is not Canada's only trading partner that has significant human rights issues. Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, even the United States faces a significant racism issue. The Israeli government is being investigated by the International Criminal Court. What do you think should be Canada's general approach to dealing with trading partners with human rights problems?
Well, this is not the place to rank the human rights abuses of different countries and to somehow put them on a sliding scale and try to come up with an appropriate trade policy. Human rights, of course, are universal and they're indivisible. And I would stress also that human rights have to be seen in their totality. There are obviously civil and political rights. There are also economic, social, and cultural rights. And we should always take the package as a whole, both in a historical context and in terms of the overall impact on society. Individual businesses in Canada have to make their own decisions about whether they want to do business in places that run against their values and their conscience. And I know many Canadian businesses refuse to do business in places in China, places in the Middle East and in Africa or Latin America, because they simply cannot tolerate the way things are done in those regimes. I think that's not only appropriate, but of course entirely within the control of individual businesses. For Canada as a whole, when it comes to a big economy such as China or the United States, my view is that we should have the kind of international policy, the kind of relationship with a big power that has so many points of connection that we do not let simply one problem in a connection affect all other parts of the relationship. This is, in a sense, the definition of a mature relationship, where you connect with the other party in multiple ways: trade, investment, culture, arts, diplomacy, education, research, so on and so forth. And you, in fact, make it an objective that you have so many connections that it's difficult for the relationship as a whole to falter because one of those relationships has gone sour. And I think that should also, well, that's certainly what we do in the United States. We don't let the fact that Americans slap tariffs on us on allegedly national security grounds stop us from pursuing border cooperation on COVID, for example. And that is a signal of the strength and the maturity of the relationship. We're not nearly there with China, but that could be something that we work towards, particularly if we define the problematique of China in a way that allows for that maturation of the relationship.
Thank you. How should Canada's strategic policy to China address the fellow democracies which are part of Greater China, that is Taiwan and Hong Kong, now at risk and where large numbers of Canadian dual nationals live?
Is the question what we should do with the dual nationals?
Yeah.
I can answer that part, and if there's more, you can jump in again.
How should Canada's strategic policy to China address the fellow democracies which are part of Greater China?
Right.
And where large numbers of Canadian dual nationals live. Yeah.
Yes. Well, Hong Kong is not a democracy, of course, and Hong Kong is a more complicated issue. There certainly have been huge setbacks for the democratic process in Hong Kong, but it would not be accurate to describe Hong Kong as a fellow democracy along the lines of Canada. I certainly think we should have an open door policy towards residents of Hong Kong, including, of course, dual nationals, to come back to Canada. There's an enormous pool of talent in Hong Kong that is already favorably disposed towards Canada. And it would be a boon to our country if this talent were to come to our shores. Now, I predict that if that happens, there will be a backlash in this country as well, because many Canadians will say that these, rich or not so rich Hong Kong immigrants are pushing up housing prices and taking jobs and so on. But that is the right thing for us to do, to welcome them to this country, particularly if we feel strongly about what is going on in Hong Kong with respect to the curtailment of civil and political rights. The longer term prospect for Hong Kong, I think, is that it is going to be absorbed by the People's Republic on a time scale that is going to be much shorter than was envisaged in the basic law and the one country, two systems model. I don't see how that can be altered significantly. The question for China more broadly is whether it will also allow the economic and presentational benefits of Hong Kong that China has benefited from since 1997, whether it will allow those benefits to be lost by absorbing Hong Kong so rapidly into a Chinese system that is clearly more liberal and which does not allow the kinds of freedoms that made Hong Kong so successful.
Thank you. Senator, can you envisage a much closer relationship with Europe in engaging China over the next 3 decades to engage more effectively in a multitude of areas where China shares interests in multilateral frameworks, rules, norms, standards of economic engagement, and climate change, environment, health system, etc.?
Yes, absolutely. And to the extent the Europeans want to pursue an approach that brings China into a multilateral or at least a plurilateral space to set standards, to enforce rules, to police and regulate, we should be part of that effort as well. Many of the challenges that we are facing with China and which China has been singled out as a problem for the West will continue to be problems even if we exclude China from our systems, because the Chinese ecosystem, say in telecommunications, is sufficiently large with its own domestic market and with markets that it has already penetrated, that we cannot rule out those systems. And so there will have to be either some way of harmonizing systems, developing common standards and rules, or setting up firewalls between these different systems, which is, of course, the whole notion of decoupling and deglobalization, which I think would be negative for the world, but especially for Canada, because we are essentially a small open economy that is highly dependent on international trade and investment.
Thank you. Senator, if Xi Jinping called you and asked you for advice, what would you tell him?
You know, it's been a puzzle to me as to why the Chinese leadership and their representatives abroad have been pursuing an approach to international relations that is so clearly damaging to their own interests. We know that in Canada. We know it just by browsing the newspapers. But we also have many opinion polls that show a growing antipathy, maybe even hostility towards China. I believe the latest poll I saw had maybe only 20% of Canadians who see China in a favorable light. And this is not just because of the specific disputes that are going on between Canada and China, but it's also because of a particular approach that China is taking. Call it whatever you will, wolf warrior or aggressive diplomacy. And it puzzles me that the Chinese Foreign Service, which is very sophisticated in all other respects, is not seeing this and not reporting it back to the leadership in Zhongnanhai. So some version of what I just said would be what I would convey to any Chinese representative who would ask for my opinion.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether you've answered part of this. What advice can you give to the Prime Minister in dealing with China so we can get the two Michaels home?
Well, it just goes back to what I said previously. I was surprised but impressed to see that the Prime Minister included in the throne speech, the recent throne speech, the priority of bringing Michael Scavo and Michael Kovrig back to Canada. But I haven't seen a new approach, a new strategy. So I can only hope that they have a new strategy, or they believe the old strategy is somehow going to work when it hasn't worked for the last 2 years. And if they were to ask for my views on a new strategy, I would start by saying what I had said to all of you just a few minutes ago, which is that there will be no solution, I don't think, that does not have both sides acknowledge and recognize at some level the legitimacy of the rule of law and the justice systems of the counterpart. My own suspicion, I'm not a forecaster here, but my own suspicion is that the Meng Wanzhou issue won't be resolved for a long time. We know that based on legal precedent. But when it is eventually resolved, my suspicion is that the resolution will be a political one. Whether the political intervention will come from the Americans or from the Chinese, I don't know. But to the extent that this is where the story is going to end, the Canadian government should also think about how it wants to write the story between now and that possible, maybe probable conclusion.
And we're approaching the end here. So we have one last question here. I'm not sure that I understand this. Should Canada work with its partners to implement a stronger approach to technology transfer to China in the context of the Wassenaar arrangement to combat, as you mentioned, the technology-based offensive against Canada?
I'm not sure I understand that question either. I'm not sure if it has to do with technical cooperation or cyber espionage and so on. But if it's the former, if it's about technology cooperation, I think we are now at a very delicate point where technology cooperation with China is highly suspect, particularly so in the United States. And some of that suspicion, whether valid or not, is spilling over into Canada, partly for practical reasons, because if Canadian universities and corporations have to work with American suppliers and procurement agencies, they may have to stay clear of connections with Chinese partners. But it it cannot be the case that we would be better off, the world would be better off without engaging China's technological capabilities. I recognize all of the risks involved and the need for precautions and so on, but as a general principle, China, it would seem to me, has a lot to offer in a variety of technical, medical, and other engineering fields, and to not find ways to work with the Chinese in any of these areas would be detrimental to the global community.
Thank you, Senator Wu. And so that brings to an end our question and answer period. Thank you for answering all those questions. And I'll turn it over to Roy.
Yes, let me add my thanks, Senator Wu, and to you, Lorraine, as well, for fielding them. I can see all the questions coming in, and having done that function, I know how hard it is to try to keep track of them all as you go along. I must say, I especially appreciate your thoughts. I mean, you're obviously highly skilled and thoughtful about these areas, and yet you're sharing with us the struggle that you're going through, putting out ideas, discussing them, hoping to encourage more debate and input. And I find that an extraordinary approach to this problem. And on behalf of everyone who's here, I want to thank you for that. I mean, I certainly learned a lot. Maybe it scares me even more about how complicated the problem is than what I thought it was before. But I suppose if we don't engage it and get the parameters right, we're never going to get to the end in a satisfactory way. And I find myself wondering if in another 4 years we'll be able to come back and see if we have seen the progression of these things, and we quite look forward to what that might be. So thank you again.
Can I just say, Roy, just quickly, because I don't want to give anyone the impression that I'm here with the answers to pronounce to all of you. I hope it was clear enough that I am indeed, as you say, struggling with these questions. And I'm trying to find different ways of framing the problematique so that I, all of you, and our leaders in government, whichever political stripe they might be, can also hopefully find fresh ways to address the China problem, which, as I say, will be the defining foreign policy challenge for this country for the foreseeable future.
Well, I'm sure if there's anything that we as an organization can do to constructively participate or contribute, that both as an organization and many of our members who have experience in this area, we'd be delighted to help, delighted to engage, to be part of trying to find a solution together. So with that, let me thank you again. And I must say, I am just delighted at the idea of independent senators working as hard as you are. So that's really great. Thank you very much. And to the audience out there, let me remind you the possibilities of our new publications that will be coming out. Check back on our website tomorrow over the next couple of days, and keep checking back over the year as we bring new events to you. You can join as a member, or you can sign up for a mailing list if you want to keep in touch. Thank you, Senator. Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you.